1 second, the space in front of Admiral Breath's flagship was empty. The next, a human warship sat inside it, 40 meters off the bow, close enough to read the hull plating by eye. No flare lit the dark. No drive trail bent behind it. No warning reached the sensor grid at all, and then a warship was simply there, flying a flag nobody in the formation had ever needed to take seriously before. Fire everything, Breath's voice cracked on the second word. 60 ships turned their guns toward one. It took them 8 seconds to do it. 8 seconds is nothing to a man crossing a room. To a formation deciding whether to live, it is an ocean. The human ship fired first. Not a beam, not a missile. A rod of solid metal, thrown hard enough that it barely mattered what physics normally allowed anyone else to do. It crossed the gap before the nearest council ship finished swinging its guns around. The first ship didn't explode so much as stop existing. Then the second, then the third. Breath counted without meaning to. 4, 5, 6, 7 ships gone, and the human vessel hadn't fired a second time. It hadn't needed to. Somewhere behind him, a junior officer said something that didn't make it past a whisper. Breath didn't ask what. He was watching the human hull, waiting for it to power up for another shot. It didn't fire again. It blinked out of existence, gone the same way it arrived, and the space where it had been sat empty and quiet, like nothing had happened there at all. 60 ships, 7 gone, and nobody in the formation knew where the next shot was coming from or when. You don't spend 30 years building something like that unless you already know how the story ends. Stay with me. It gets worse for the ones who didn't. 3 weeks before any of that, the summons came on a Tuesday, not a dramatic Tuesday. No alarms swept Verath Station, no lights flashed red down the corridors. Just a short message on Ambassador Nera Cass's console requesting her presence at the deliberation hall in 3 hours. She read it twice, not because she didn't understand it. Careful phrasing from the council always meant something had already been decided before she walked into the room. Cass had been Earth's voice on this station for years now, long enough to learn that punctuality here was its own kind of surrender. Arrive early and the room read it as fear. Arrive on time and the room read it as obedience. She left with time to spare and walked slowly enough to land right on the edge of late. And she did it holding a cup of tea she had no intention of finishing before the meeting, because a woman carrying tea into a tribunal was a woman who wasn't afraid of one. The deliberation hall was built to make visitors feel small. The ceiling climbed 30 meters overhead. The seats rose in a steep arc, so every delegate looked down at whoever stood at the center table. Cass had stood at that table more times than she could easily count, and she had never once looked up at the gallery. Looking up was what the room wanted. Admiral Breath was already in the gallery when she walked in. That told her more than the summons had. Breath was 2 meters and change of scaled grey hide and jaw ridges, and he did not attend charge readings. He attended verdicts. He sat with both hands flat on the rail in front of him, the way he always did when he was certain, and his breathing had the faint rasp it got when he wasn't. Suz, the Velhari elder who chaired sessions like this one, didn't look up from her slate. Ambassador Cass, please take the floor. Cass took it. Suz read the charge without inflection, the way she'd read a grocery list. Violation of Article 7. Unregistered weapons development. The prescribed remedy. Dissolution of Earth's fleet. Mandatory inspection of every human shipyard and research station. And a freeze on Earth's voting rights until the Council was satisfied that the violation had ended. Nobody in the room expected Cass to react. She didn't. I'd like the specific violations, please, she said. Not the article number, the list. Suz passed a data chip across the table. Cass plugged it into her reader. The document loaded, 43 pages, and she read every one of them while the room waited, because skimming would have told them she was scared, and she wasn't going to hand them that for free. When she finished, she set the reader down flat on the table, the way you set down something you're not going to pick back up in anger. Earth will provide a formal response within 1 day, she said, and walked out before anyone could tell her to sit back down. She found an alcove 3 corridors from the hall, empty at that hour, and opened an encrypted channel to Geneva. Director Dan Ray answered on the second ring, sitting in a windowless room the way he'd sat in windowless rooms for most of his career. How bad? Article 7, full package, fleet dissolution, inspections, a voting freeze. Cass kept her voice level. I bought us a day. Ray went quiet long enough that she checked the connection. They don't know, he said finally. Not the specifics. If they knew what we actually built, they wouldn't have opened with an inspection demand. They'd have opened with a blockade. That's not comforting, Dan. Wasn't meant to be. A pause, the kind he used when he was deciding how much to say. You did the right thing asking for the list. It tells us exactly how much they don't know, and that's worth more than the day you bought us. Cass glanced back down the corridor toward the hall, where Breath was still sitting in a gallery he had no business being in. He was there, watching. He doesn't attend charge readings. He attends verdicts. Then he already thinks he knows how this ends. Does he? Ray didn't answer that directly. Get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be long. He cut the channel before she could push him on it, which was its own kind of answer, and Cass stood in the empty corridor a moment longer, holding a cup of tea that had already gone cold. 30 years earlier, in a windowless committee room in Nairobi, a 22-year-old physicist named Paul Adara stood in front of 6 unimpressed officials and told them humanity was going to lose a war it hadn't been declared in yet. Nobody laughed, which she took as a bad sign. Laughing would have meant they thought she was wrong. The Council's accords regulate weapons they already understand, she said. Beams, warheads, biological agents. They wrote 400 years of rules around what they already know how to build. They never wrote a rule for something they haven't imagined yet, because you can't legislate against an idea you've never had. A younger Dan Ray sat at the end of the table, saying nothing, the way he'd go on to say nothing in 100 rooms just like it. What are you proposing? Someone finally asked. 2 things nobody's built. A weapon that throws mass instead of energy, because their shields are tuned for energy. And a way to move a ship without crossing the space in between, because every one of their tactics assumes you can see something coming. How long? Adara didn't blink. 30 years, maybe longer. The room went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when they've decided not to say no out loud. Ray was the one who spoke first. What do you need to start? That was the whole meeting. No vote, no announcement, no press release. Just a line item buried so deep in a defense budget that most of the people who approved it never knew what it funded. Adara got a lab, then a second lab, then a hangar nobody outside 4 people had clearance to enter, and 30 years brought her all the way to the EDS Iron Meridian sitting dark in a bay outside Geneva with a hull that had never once been photographed by anyone who wasn't already sworn to secrecy. Ray closed the old file on his desk and opened a new channel. Osei, it's time. Captain Dar Osei took the call standing on his own bridge, hand resting on the rail the way it always did before a shift changed. He didn't ask what had happened. He'd been briefed enough over the years to know this call only came one way. Array status, he said instead. Stable, Adara answered, older now, grey at the temples, but the same voice from that committee room. She'd followed the project the whole 30 years, from theory to hangar to bridge. Rail capacitors at full charge. We've run this drill 40 times. This isn't a drill. Understood. Osei looked out at the dark past the forward viewport, where nothing was visible yet but would be soon. Brief the senior staff. Nobody below that clearance hears a word. Back on Verath Station, Cass sat in her quarters with a cup of tea she still hadn't finished, running the charge documents again, looking for the seam. Somewhere in 43 pages, there had to be a thread she could pull. She found it on the 11th read. Article 7 covered directed energy systems, biological agents, and missile warheads. Kinetic launch systems weren't listed. Not omitted by accident. SUS didn't write accidental documents. Just never imagined. because nobody in 400 years had needed to imagine a weapon that didn't fit the categories they already had names for. She didn't send that thread to Ray yet. Some threads you don't pull until you know exactly how far they unravel. What she sent instead was shorter. A single line, buried in a routine diplomatic status update that would draw no attention from anyone monitoring the channel. Council moving faster than the clock we agreed on. Confirm readiness. The answer came back in under a minute. Confirmed. We were ready before you asked. She read it twice, the way she read everything, and for the first time since the summons arrived, she let herself feel something close to relief. It didn't last. Admiral Breath was not a patient man by nature, and 400 years of council doctrine had never asked him to be one. He sat in his own strategy room aboard the fleet flagship, staring at a formation plot that told him everything he needed to know and nothing he wanted to. They asked for a day to respond, said the officer beside him. The day isn't up. The day was a courtesy, Breath said. Courtesies are for species that might actually comply. He breathed the way he breathed when his confidence and his instincts disagreed with each other, a faint rasp under the words. Move the blockade formation into position now. Full readiness. I want every ship where it needs to be well before that clock runs out. Sir, that's not the schedule the Council approved. The Council approved a deadline. I'm not moving the deadline. I'm moving the ships. Breath's hands went flat on the console in front of him, the way they always did when he'd already decided. If they're innocent, nothing changes. If they're not, I'd rather be early than sorry. 60 warships began breaking formation and reforming into a tighter blockade shape. Hours ahead of the timeline anyone on Earth's side had been told to expect. Cass felt the shift before she understood it, a change in the traffic patterns on the public sensor feed, ships moving where ships weren't supposed to move yet. She pulled up the plot in her quarters and watched the formation tighten in real time, and her stomach went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the tea. She opened the channel to Ray again. No pleasantries this time. They're not waiting for the deadline. The whole fleet is moving into blockade position right now. There was a pause on the other end that lasted exactly as long as it took Ray to look at a second screen. How much time did that just cost us? I don't know exactly. Hours, not days. Another pause, shorter. It's enough. It has to be enough. His voice didn't shake, but it also didn't have its usual certainty, and Cass had known him long enough to hear the difference. Get somewhere safe. Don't go back to the hall. Dan. Nera, get somewhere safe. The channel cut. She sat alone in her quarters, tea gone cold beside her for the second time that week, and watched the plot on her screen as 60 ships finished closing into a formation built to look unbreakable from the outside. Somewhere past the edge of that formation, in the dark where no sensor on any council ship could reach, the iron meridian was already moving. Osai stood on the bridge with both hands behind his back, watching a countdown that wasn't measured in minutes anymore. They're early, he said, mostly to himself. They think that buys them something. Adara at the console beside him didn't look up from the array readout. Does it? No, Osai's voice didn't rise. It never did. It just means they'll find out sooner. He keyed the ship-wide channel, and his next words went out to every soul aboard, calm and flat and final. All hands, prepare for insertion. The dark outside the Iron Meridian's hull didn't change. That was the strange part. Osa would think later that something so total could happen without so much as a flicker of light. Insertion in 3, Adara said. 2, 1. The ship didn't feel anything. There was no lurch, no shudder, nothing a body could register as movement. One moment they were nowhere anyone could find them. The next, 60 council warships filled the viewport, close enough that Osai could see running lights on individual hulls. 40 meters off the nearest one. Close enough to spit at, if spitting were a tactic anyone still used. Aboard the flagship, Breath had been mid-sentence when it happened, hand halfway to the tea cooling on the console beside him. a habit he'd never broken in 312 years of service. The same small, ordinary motion he made in every strategy session, whether the news was good or bad. He never got to finish it. "Fire everything," he said, and the word came out cracked, because some part of him already knew 8 seconds wasn't going to be fast enough, even before anyone told him so. It wasn't. The Iron Meridian's rail guns didn't fire beams. They threw metal, solid tungsten, accelerated hard enough that the physics stopped mattering to anyone standing in the way. The first rod crossed the gap before the nearest council ship had finished turning its guns. 7 ships, gone in the time it took breath to draw one more breath. No explosions spread outward the way explosions were supposed to. Each hit was closer to a light switching off. There, then not there, debris scattering outward in a widening ring that used to be a hull. On one of those 7 ships had been a junior logistics officer named Tolan Vash, who 3 hours earlier had sent a message home about a promotion he was hoping to hear about by the end of the month. Nobody on the Iron Meridian knew his name. Nobody would, not for a long time. Then the Iron Meridian was gone again, blinked out the way it had blinked in, and for 4 full seconds the council formation held its breath, guns tracking empty space, waiting for something to reappear. It reappeared far enough away that nothing in the formation had time to turn and face it. A second volley. More hulls stopped existing in the same clean, silent way the first ones had. No warning, no negotiation, no second chance that had been the whole design, the whole 30 years, distilled into a handful of seconds nobody on the council side had been ready to survive. Oss watched the formation break apart on the tactical display, ships scattering in every direction at once, no order to it anymore, just 60 captains individually deciding that staying in place was the fastest way to die. "Ceasefire," he said, not a question, not a request, an order to himself as much as anyone. He opened the broadcast on every frequency the council fleet was known to monitor. No further vessels will be targeted, provided all council ships maintain current heading away from this position. The retreat that followed wasn't orderly. It wasn't supposed to be. Council ships peeled off the formation in clusters, engines flaring bright enough to be visible from Verath Station's own sensor arrays. And within minutes the tight, unbreakable shape Breath had built hours ahead of schedule had come apart into 40 scattered hulls running for open space. Breath didn't give the order to retreat. He didn't give any order at all. He sat with both hands flat on the console, breathing the ragged breath of a man who had built his entire career on a kind of certainty that had just stopped being true in front of him, and said nothing while his fleet fell apart around his silence. Back on Verath Station, the deliberation hall wasn't designed for chaos. It had 400 years of precedent built into its architecture specifically to prevent it: steep seating, a single speaking floor, procedures for every kind of disagreement anyone had ever anticipated. Nobody had anticipated this. Delegates were on their feet, shouting over each other in 6 different languages at once. Sensor feeds from the engagement scrolling across the wall behind them faster than anyone could read. And in the middle of it, a voice that hadn't spoken once in the entire session cut through, quiet enough that the room had to fight its own noise to hear it. "Sit down," said Vel. The Drath historian had said nothing since the session opened, 3 days ago now by the station's clock, old enough and quiet enough that most of the gallery had stopped registering he was in the room at all. He wasn't shouting. He didn't need to. Something in the stillness of him made people stop. "I would like to read Article 7 aloud," Vel said. "All of it, not the summary, the text." Suz, still gripping her slate with both hands, looked at him like she'd forgotten he could speak. "Now is not the time for a reading, historian." "I think it is exactly the time." Vel didn't sit. He didn't raise his voice either. "Because I have read this article 11 times since the charge was filed, and I would like every delegate in this room to hear, in the original language, precisely what it does and does not say." Nobody stopped him. He began to read, slow and even, the 400-year-old text rolling out into a room that had gone, for the first time in the entire session, completely silent. Nobody had gotten to the third sentence yet. Whatever it said, it hadn't landed. But something in the way Vel's hands were steady, while everyone else's weren't told the room this wasn't going to end the way anyone in the gallery had expected 3 hours ago. Article 7, Vel read, shall apply to all directed energy weapon systems, all biological or chemical agents intended for military use, and all missile-based warhead delivery systems developed, tested, or deployed by any signatory species. He paused there, letting the sentence sit in the silence he'd made. That is the complete list, he said. I have read it 11 times looking for a fourth category. There isn't one. Kinetic launch systems, solid mass, thrown by mechanical or magnetic force, were never listed, not omitted by oversight, simply never imagined because in 400 years no species party to this accord ever built one worth regulating. Suzz's slate had gone still in her hands. That is a technicality. Specificity in legal documents creates edges, Vel said. We wrote this article with edges. Humanity found the space outside them. That is not a violation. That is a species reading our own laws more carefully than we did. Nobody in the gallery spoke. Breath's seat, empty since the retreat order that never came, sat conspicuous in the row where he should have been sitting. The charge would not have survived formal review, Vel went on. The humans could have contested it in this chamber with lawyers for months. They chose not to. They chose to demonstrate it instead. He looked up, and for the first time his even voice carried something close to weight. Nobody had expected this. That had been the point. An aide found Cass in her quarters an hour later, tea finally finished. The data chip with her Article 7 notes sitting untouched on the table where she'd left it 3 nights ago. They're asking for you, the aide said. The chamber. Tell them 20 minutes. Cass didn't move to gather anything yet. 20 minutes late had worked for her for 8 years. She saw no reason to change the habit on the one day it mattered most. When she did walk in, the room had changed shape. The steep gallery seating that had loomed over her a week ago now sat level with the floor. Someone had reconfigured it overnight, whether from panic or courtesy she couldn't tell and didn't ask. Delegates who had looked down at her before now looked at her straight on. Breath's chair was empty. She set a single data chip on the table in front of her. Proposed Framework for Galactic Armament Review, 3rd Draft. This has been in development for 22 years, she said. Long before the charge. Long before any of this was necessary. It replaces categorical weapon bans with a rotating oversight council. No single species holding veto rights, membership reassigned every 3 cycles. A Velhari delegate near the front leaned forward. And enforcement. Transparency instead of prohibition. Cass folded her hands. We sent the complete specifications for the rail system and the insertion array to every ambassador in this network 6 hours ago. Anyone who wants to build what we built has everything they need to do it. That landed harder than the framework itself. A ripple went through the gallery, delegates turning to each other, someone near the back saying the word everyone like it didn't fit in their mouth. You're giving it away, Suz said. The one advantage that just saved your entire fleet from a blockade, and you're handing it to the species who tried to dissolve you. A technology only one species has is a threat, Cass said. A technology everyone has is just a technology. We didn't build this to keep an edge. We built it because we didn't want to need one again. Breath entered from the back of the chamber while she was still speaking, moving slower than she'd ever seen him move, uniform correct, jaw set. 312 years of certainty, visibly recalculating itself with every step. He didn't sit. He stopped a few paces from the table and looked at her the way a man looks at a bill he can't dispute. How many ships do you have? He asked. Not a threat, not anymore. Just a question from someone who genuinely needed to know how the rest of his life was going to work. Enough, Cass said. He held her gaze a moment longer, breathing the ragged breath she now understood he'd probably had for years. long before any of this started. Then he turned and took the empty seat in the gallery. The first time in the entire session he had sat among the delegates instead of above them. The vote came an hour later, all but two delegations in favor, one abstaining. Vel read the result aloud, the same even voice he'd used to read Article 7, and nobody in the room challenged it. Word reached the Iron Meridian while it still sat in the debris field it had made, hull dark, rail capacitors, finally cooling for the first time in 6 minutes and 40 seconds of engagement that had ended a war before most of the galaxy knew it had started. Framework passed, Adara said, reading the update off her console. Osai, we're being recalled. Osai stood at the forward viewport a moment longer, looking out at what was left of a formation that had been unbreakable that morning, scattered plating catching starlight at odd angles, slowly drifting apart, no longer arranged in any shape that meant anything. He thought of Tolan Vash without knowing the name, the way you think of something you'll never get the details of and carry anyway. Set a course for Earth, he said. Behind him, the debris kept turning slow circles in the dark, catching light and losing it, catching light and losing it, until there was nothing left to distinguish one piece from any other. It was just debris now. Earth was going home.